Healing in Rise of Kingdoms can be extremely strange with the way it works and how in some situations it can completely screw you over and cause you to take a bunch of severely wounded units and get horrible trades, but in other situations it can be extremely useful. So today I'll be talking all about healing and how it works, how battle reports overall work, because that is quite important when you discuss healing, advantages to it, disadvantages to it, and when you should actually use some type of a healing commander, and which commanders with healing do still work. So if you are interested in today's video, especially if you have a commander who has some amount of healing, you're considering investing in a commander that has healing, or you just want to get more value for your account, you definitely need to check out today's video. So we'll start off with discussing how healing works, but before we do that, we'll discuss how battle reports work and how fighting in Rise of Kingdoms actually works, because that's an easy way to explain how healing works after you fully understand all of that. To begin with, whenever you enter a battle, you begin with units. These units are not slightly wounded, severely wounded, or dead. They are just normal troops, basically what you have in your city normally. Every single turn, depending on the circumstances, you will be guaranteed to take some amount of slightly wounded units. That is always going to happen. If you do a full turn of combat, you're going to take at least one slightly wounded unit. Then, you will at least take, on most occasions, one severely wounded unit. These units can be healed in your hospital, and the thing to note with severely wounded units and slightly wounded units and even dead units, they can't change their category. If you have a severely wounded unit, it can't go from severely wounded to dead or slightly wounded. If you have a dead unit, it can't go from dead to severely wounded or slightly wounded. If you have a slightly wounded unit, it can't become severely wounded or dead. So that's something to keep in mind. And every turn, the amount of those troops will be randomized pretty much based on the damage you take. The type of category they get given will also be not really randomized. I think they have some sort of an equation for it. So that is something to keep in mind. The more damage you take, the more severely wounded deads you're going to take. I think that's pretty self-explanatory. But how does healing work? Well, a lot of people mix up healing with being able to heal severely wounded units, which is just wrong. Healing can only help slightly wounded units cross the barrier to become normal units again. And the issue with healing arises here, and this is where all the disadvantages come in. When you heal, you're bringing back a unit that's not supposed to become severely wounded. If you have a slightly wounded unit, that unit is not ever supposed to become severely wounded without some amount of healing. If you heal that unit, they can become a severely wounded unit, and especially if you're healing them in low amounts, like a commander like Richard or Boudica does, you're giving yourself such a small amount of troops where it's not actually worth risking getting more severely wounded units, and there's where the issue with healing comes in. In the open field, and whenever you fight players, you take more severely wounded units. You'll be taking even more because you're bringing back your slightly wounded units, which should have just been there to begin with. They should not have changed. They should stay slightly wounded, and giving them another chance to become severely wounded. And once they become severely wounded, they're stuck there. There's no healing them. So what healing does is, it's going to heal your march, but over time, it's basically going to make every single unit in your march severely wounded. Especially if you're up against someone who's not dealing crazy damage. Like if I hit a Richard, they'll maybe get 20,000 heal in before they're dead because I've just got crazy skill damage. But if someone with an infantry march hits a Richard, they might get 100,000 healing in before they die, which means they might take 3, 5, 10,000 more severely wounded units than they normally would if they had no healing. Now, obviously, you can't really judge it on a Richard. A Richard is a fairly bad commander, but even personally, when I run just Boudica Prime with LIANG, if I'm doing a 1v1 battle with someone especially, and I notice my march getting low, but I'm still technically a little bit of sevs above them, I'm going to lose that trade because I'm healing. And I notice that over time, yeah, the healing allows me to win the battle, which means I'll never ever get a defeat in a 1v1, but I'm probably going to lose the trade. Well, not never ever get a defeat. Obviously, a Nevsky or something is going to beat me, but if you're in a 1v1 situation with a healing commander, they're basically not going to die unless you have some counter to them, which is good in some situations. But the disadvantage is you're taking a bunch of severely wounded units for what? Like, you get to stay alive? I think that you'd rather be dead and back in your city and healing the severely wounded units than getting even more but staying on the field. That is really one major thing to do with healing. Another issue with healing definitely arises in city garrisons, especially city garrisons, where the issue of healing troops becomes way more prominent, because in a city garrison, you can't leave combat. If you're fighting on the open field and you have a commander who heals, you just turn around and you start running. Yeah, you're going to take a bunch of severely wounded units, but you're going to stop healing. So you can stop your hospital from completely filling up. In a city garrison, if you're running a commander who heals and you get rallied and you're healing constantly, you're screwed. You will just be healing constantly all the slightly wounded troops that you have, and then all your severely wounded will be piling in your hospital. And because it's a city garrison, the numbers are going to be way higher. Like, you'll be healing 20,000 a turn, especially if you've got like a very, very high healing march. Maybe you've got a Zeno and a Richard on your city wall. You'll be healing crazy numbers. And if someone's hitting you with a rally like an Attila Takeda, where it's not really killing you fast, killing you slowly to deal as many sevs as it can, and you're healing, your city is done for, because you're going to keep healing those slightly wounded units, filling up your hospital, and over time, since you've got like millions of units in this march, you're literally going to die. You are going to fill your hospital up until all you get is a bunch of dead troops. Then also, if you're healing with a city garrison, if someone's swarming you down, if someone is rallying you, the rally is not going to end up burning your city wall. Usually what you want to happen if you're in a city garrison situation is you want your city wall to die. You want it to run out of troops because they all become slightly wounded. But if you're healing back the slightly wounded units, that can't happen. So the rally sticks on for longer, swarm will possibly stick on for longer, and that's where you take even more severely wounded units, on top of the fact you're bringing back slightly wounded units to severely wound them once again. Now, you may be thinking, well, if this applies to a city garrison, why shouldn't it really apply to a flag? Why would you want healing on a flag more than you would want it on a city garrison? And I think it's very simple, and this does bring me on to the advantages of healing. It's because whenever you're healing in a flag, first of all, you're going off the white numbers on that flag. If that flag is getting like 50,000 to 10,000, you know it's going to burn. You're probably going to pull the troops out. But if you're running a flag with a Xeno and maybe a Heraclius, and the white numbers are fairly equal, your goal is to keep that flag up. Honestly, you don't usually care about how many dead troops you get. If your main goal is to keep a flag up for as long as possible, you don't care about how many deads you're taking. And the thing with a flag is also, you're pulling troops out and putting new troops in, which also counts as new types of troops. So yeah, they're going to be healed as well, but they're already fully stocked up. And then if they get healed, it's going to heal the other troops that are already in the flag. And especially with the healing garrison, if it's in a pass, it's never going to die. So that's a thing to keep in mind. So sometimes, especially if you want to keep something alive, healing is amazing. And even on the open field, if you want to keep something alive, healing is going to be really good. If you have a Richard, like I said, in a 1v1 situation, especially if it's one of the older commanders, maybe you're fighting like a Minamoto, the Richard's going to sit there for like 2 minutes and just tank. He's just going to tank damage, tank and tank and tank and tank, and eventually he might die. Eventually the Minamoto might die, but it's just going to be a slow and painful death for either one of them, but you're going to stay alive the whole time. In that point, you're just tanking as much as you can and allowing your teammates to do a ton of extra damage, especially with a commander like Richard, who's healing slowly over time and basically just saying, screw you, I'm not going to die, keep trying, and he keeps healing slowly. He's never going to die, but that's something good about healing, because you're never ever going to lose if you keep it stocked up, or if you keep the healing running, you don't really get swarmed down. And that's where the flag comes in. If you keep a flag with a Xeno up there and you keep it reinforced, it's not going to die. Even if they swarm it, it's probably not going to die, because Xeno's going to keep healing as long as you keep it reinforced properly. Now, granted, healing in a garrison can also be bad in a situation where possibly you want the flag to actually somewhat burn. You're like, okay, we can probably take a burn on this flag, but the garrison keeps healing troops, and there's no point kicking everyone out, because when you kick everyone out, then the rally is going to kill whatever's left in there. So what happens is, in those situations, you're taking a bunch of unnecessary deads, because a commander like Xeno will keep healing back all the slightly wounded units that you took, and she's going to make them into dead troops. So that is some really bad parts of running a garrison, especially with the Xeno. She's going to heal back slightly wounded units and then cause them to die, and that's the thing. If you're doing that, it's a trade-off. You're going to possibly take a bad trade unless you got a really, really good Zenobia, and then you're also going to keep the flag up most likely. So there's the issue. Would you rather trade the extra troops to keep that flag up? Is it that pivotal to keep up that you're going to run a Xeno? Or can you risk running a garrison that's probably going to maybe die, like a Jan Ziska with a Heraclius, because there's no healing in that. But with a Zenobia, you know you're going to heal back a bunch of slightly wounded units, which can go into battle, and they're probably not going to die. So there is the trade-off you would have to make with a flag. Also, another advantage to healing is you are bringing back troops which would be otherwise useless in combat. I did mention that this is bad, bringing back troops that are already in a specific state, like slightly wounded, but it can be good. Obviously, we know in Rise of Kingdoms, the more troops you have, the better you're going to trade. It does make sense. The more troops in real life, if an army rocks up with 500,000 swordsmen and one of them rocks up with 100,000, most likely the army with 500,000 is going to win. So it does make sense that it's structured like this, and obviously if you're healing, even whether it be 2,000, 3,000 troops a turn, you're either going to live longer, obviously, because you're going to be more tanky, or you're going to be able to deal more damage, because the more troops you have in your march, the more damage you deal. Obviously, especially in the case of a Richard or a Boudica Prime, where you're only healing small amounts in the grand scheme of things, like, even if you heal 5,000 a turn, you've got, like, up to 500, 600,000 troops in a march, if you got, like, max crystal tech and you're running every boost. So, definitely isn't going to make a major difference. You're going to notice, like, okay, I mean, I'm healing, I'm going to have a few more troops in my march, but I'm healing like 5,000. It's like 1/10 of what's in my march if you're a big whale. So it's not too different for most players. And even at my level, if I have a full Richard march and I'm running only infantry and my retro is expertise, I'd probably be healing 4,000 troops a skill cycle, which is like every 6 turns, which isn't that much. Overall, it's not going to change that much. Obviously, it's going to make me trade slightly better for like 1 or 2 turns till all those troops are severely wounded or slightly wounded again. But it's something that you can keep in mind, making you trade obviously a little bit better in some situations. Now, a situation where this can be exemplified and made way more prominent is when a commander does literal boatloads of healing in a really short period of time. And the only commander I can really pinpoint this to is Constantine. And in these situations where Constantine is bringing back slightly wounded units, he's not bringing back a small amount. He's bringing back 15,000 healing factor, which is probably close to 80, maybe even 100,000 units in one hit. In those situations, healing is really good because you're bringing back a large amount of troops, which are going to help you trade way better. If you're in a garrison, that garrison's going to take way less damage. So you can see right there, if you're doing a big hit of just healing, just crazy amount, 15,000 troops healed, then you're going to trade way better because you're healing a crazy number of troops in one turn. In that turn, you're going to have way more troops than your opponent, especially if they aren't dealing crazy amounts of damage. Obviously, nowadays, when a Constantine goes up against most marches, it's going to lose just because it's not going to last that long. It's going to get its healing, and those troops will also die like the rest of them. But you run a Constantine, and he gets the massive healing, and it's a fairly even fight. That healing is going to shoot him way above everyone else, and he's just going to win. So in situations where you're healing crazy amounts, that is where it becomes really powerful. Whether it be healing like 15,000 in one turn, or healing 700 a turn every single turn for 10 turns. Those situations of healing crazy numbers are when you actually begin to notice, oh, I have way more troops than my opponent, I'm trading way better. But unless it's that, you're going to usually get more disadvantages than advantages. The next advantage to healing is you do bring yourself a lot more sustain on the field, being able to allow yourself to live longer. If I was running my Boudica Prime without healing in the open field, she's not going to live as long, especially if I'm doing long skirmishes where she's throwing her active skill a bunch and the opponents are throwing their active skill a bunch. If I didn't have my Boudica Prime, she's probably going to die really quickly. But if you're running commanders who can heal, they're often going to bring back slightly wounded units, which are the largest proportion of your troop missing. If you look at battle reports and you look at the amount of 7 wins you get and the amount of deads you get, it's way lower than the amount of slightly wounded you get. Like a garrison with 1 million dead troops, for example, which is a crazy number, is going to have like 1 billion slightly wounded units because it's just how it works. You're going to take way more slightly wounded units than you take severely wounded units. And if you're healing, you're going to allow those slightly wounded units to obviously come back from that state where they would be completely useless and still fight, which means you don't have to go back to your city as often. If I was running a Richard in the open field and I would usually get 80,000 slightly wounded units from an engagement, for example, that Richard is going to heal maybe 40,000 of them. And in that situation, I'm going to not have to return to my city as soon as I normally would, since I've got less than half the slightly wounded units I would normally have. So that is definitely something to consider. Now, obviously, this does become obsolete when all your other marchers are not healing. So if you're running a Nevsky and you got a Richard out there, and the Richard's not the tank, he's just one of your marchers, the being able to sustain yourself is useless because you're not going to run your Nevsky in the ground unless you're a Mega Whale. So what's going to end up happening is you're going to return to your city for your Nevsky anyways, and then your Richard's going to be at like full troops, so it doesn't really matter. If you're running just a Richard though, you're going to keep him on the field for like 2 hours before you have to do anything, just because he heals so much. The final advantage is definitely when you're barb farming. If you are barb farming with healing commanders, you can keep those commanders alive for almost forever. I personally did like 100 Marauders in a row forever. Like I did not die because I was running some very basic healing on a bunch of my barbarian commanders, and they were just able to destroy the Marauders so fast that they healed so quickly, and they were healing enough to where I basically didn't have to return to my city. So running healing commanders, especially when doing barbarian fights, in Sunset Canyon where you don't want to die, in Golden Kingdom as well where you don't want to lose, you just want to keep your marchers alive, that's where healing becomes really good. One thing to note with healing and peacekeeping commanders specifically, they have a really good talent at the end of their talent tree that gives them a nice healing factor after they defeat barbarians. Really good for Home Kingdom, really good for Marauders, kind of useless for the KVK barbarians. It does make a slight difference, but not too crazy. So if you do want to use this as a talent build, which is what I'd personally do if you want to do a good barb farm build, just run this exact talent build and then pick anything else. This is what I do. I just run full peacekeeping to get the healing so that you can sustain yourself a little bit longer out there, sometimes making the march almost immortal. Overall, I don't recommend healing for the open field. I think it's one of the worst things most players can try to do, become like a healing person where they just, maybe they run something as dumb as a Cleopatra to heal people. In those situations, healing is really bad. If you're doing a city garrison, healing is literally the worst thing you can do because your city's not going to die, you're just going to take a ton of deads. If you're doing a normal garrison, it's only good in specific situations, and there's only really, in my opinion, one commander who truly benefits an absolute boatload from his healing, and that is Constantine, because he heals so much so quickly, and that's going to give him a ton of troops, giving him a major advantage. Obviously, Richard also does benefit because it is one of the main things in his kit, but nowadays, especially when Richard is a commander who is definitely outdated and he's still healing troops that are going to become severely wounded, it's definitely not as good. And obviously, Boudica Prime is going to still stay as a good commander regardless of how much she heals, just because she is already such a powerful commander and the healing doesn't really change that much whether or not she's trading positive or negative. Overall, I wouldn't recommend healing as something to focus down on. It's never ever going to be something I would say is a decider in a commander's kit. I see it, I'm like, wow, they got healing, I need that commander. Usually, it's something I see and I'm like, it's got more disadvantages than it does advantages, especially for the open field, if anything. I'd actually recommend if a commander has healing to probably skip them, except Boudica Prime, obviously. She is the one example, just because she is completely loaded with stats, and the healing is just a small secondary thing that doesn't really change much. So, overall, I'd say most free-to-players, you definitely have to skip healing. Now, I'm recording this video on the day of my birthday, and I'm editing it the day after, so if you want to show your appreciation for my content and show that maybe I taught you something new, consider subscribing. YouTube loves it when people subscribe. I'm actually pointing down right now, and you can't even see it. So subscribe. Once I hit 10,000 subscribers, I'll consider doing a face reveal. Subscribe. Now, I just want to say thank you for watching and hope to see you in the next one.